Okay, and we are back. And I am, of course, Karl Straub, and this is my friend and colleague of many years, Gina.
Hi.
And this is our podcast, which is called, what's it called again, Gina?
Put it quite frankly.
Yeah, you forgot the first part that has our names.
Gina and Karl put it quite frankly.
That's right, that's the name. Okay, and this is the episode where we are going to talk for a long time about the song "Lie." And when we did our first draft of this, we talked more than an hour about it. I don't know if we're gonna. Maybe we can get it up to 2 hours today. I don't know. We'll see. I hope spring's eternal. Okay. But we also have a few things we need to talk about. First, we should do our housekeeping here, which is we mostly already did that. We are Gina and Karl, and our show is called Gina and Karl Put It Quite Frankly. And what are the things that we always want to remind people about my YouTube channel?
Please like, subscribe, and comment.
Yes, please do. I know you guys probably hear this a lot if you listen to podcasts a lot, but it really makes a huge difference. It essentially is what enables us to keep doing this. If we don't have people liking, subscribing, and commenting, especially subscribing, then we won't be able to keep doing it. And we've got a bunch of these episodes of the show in the can, a bunch of interesting BTS content coming up, and so we would like to keep broadcasting that stuff. So with your help, we can do that. And there's some, before we get into, we are going to be talking about that song today, mostly Gina, but before we do that, there is some news. As we record this, there was some news that came in earlier today. You want to address that? Some BTS news.
Yes. It's having to do with the BTS military service, the looming military service.
That's right. It's been looming. It's been looming for a while, and it continues to loom.
Well, apparently, Jin does not have to, show up for military service until sometime during 2023, which is good news because everybody thought it was in December he had to go. But also, the president has requested proposals on the alternative military service and the fairness of alternative military service from the head of, I can't remember what this gentleman is the head of, the Ministry of Culture, Sports, and Tourism. He has asked for proposals on alternative military service. So as opposed to being in the military for 18 months and having to be on base all the time, they're going to be allowed to possibly take however many days to do things for the country. So if there's a concert, it's for promoting the country.
Okay.
So all right. That they are now looking at proposals. There will possibly be a hearing in the future. So once again, what we know is practically nothing.
That's right. That's been consistent for a while. It essentially essentially it was a news report reminding us that we know nothing.
Exactly. There's a little sprinkling of question marks on top of nothing.
That's right. Okay. And do we need to give any background? I mean, we talked about this for hours on other episodes that have not aired yet, but our hand has been forced by this news, the new non-revelation. We've been forced to bring it up again. Do we need to give more? Do we need to flesh out what we don't know at this point? Is that important?
I don't think so, because basically, once again, it's just kind of an elongated question mark, as we have constantly had. I mean, the only point that we ever had real information was when they did change the law allowing certain people to extend the time before they had to report for military duty. Now we're back into a pile of question marks, and the only thing that I could possibly say about it is it's, again, I've said it before, not my country, not my military, not my war.
Yeah, we're not judging it. I think we should clarify. we don't have standing to have an opinion about their policies about that. I'm respectful of it. They can do whatever they want, whatever works for them.
But how I feel, especially after hearing the news this morning, the one thing I can honestly say, and I don't care if somebody gets mad that I'm having an opinion on this, please quit jerking these guys around.
I think that's reasonable.
I think that's perfectly reasonable because at this point they're used as political pawn.
I just wanted, in case anybody was wondering, what happened was my dog Hank did, I think, have a problem with what you just said, and he left the room.
Oh, Hank.
Or maybe to be fair to him, shouldn't assume that I know what's going through his mind. Maybe he just agreed with you about the jerking around business. He doesn't care for it.
Well, and the thing is there's so much back and forth, so much seesawing up and down, blah, blah, blah. And at no point have they ever said that they won't go or that they don't want to go.
Yeah.
And
so
other people debating the issue around them. And I mean, I hate to be that person, because people are going, well, they're rich and famous, who cares? Well, here's the thing. You're 20-something years old, and your government is deciding whether or not you have to, stop doing what you're doing for almost 2 years. Just decide what you want them to do.
Yeah, well, here's my take on it. I mean, for what it's worth, the whole world, I guess, is watching. They need to know what I think about this, since I know virtually nothing about it. But it seems to me that there's a big difference between weighing in on their government policy about this military service. I don't have an opinion about that. I mean, it seems to me that, again, it's appropriate for them. They can do whatever they want. But I do think it's fair to say that it is kind of dubious that they've spent several years not making up their mind what to do about it, and now they've just announced that they're gonna take some chunk of the next year to figure it out. But there's no guarantee they'll even figure it out in that year, right? I mean, they might just announce at the end of the year they're extending it again, because they've already extended it
2 years,
more than once, right? It's been.
And it's only been extended once that I know of.
But for 2 years.
But for 2 years.
It was a 2-year extension.
It was a 2-year extension, and it was a big production, and it was an actual, change to an amendment to the law. But the only people that qualify for the amendment are those 7 guys. So.
Right.
That was one thing. But I think what's happening is I guarantee you that business owners, financial people in and around where the concert's going to be next week are reporting a major uptick in business. And if those 7 guys aren't around to drum up business for you, I mean, they're definitely, they bring the money. That's the bottom line.
Yeah, exactly. It seems to me that the government really should have figured out what they were going to do about it, and I hope that this new extension comes along with some understanding that they are really working on making a decision. This
We'd even be talking about this if BTS didn't exist. That right there should be enough for you to. None of this would be happening. We wouldn't have a podcast. There wouldn't be a secondary industry of people reacting. There wouldn't be any of this. So.
No.
People are paying attention to your country. Why? Not right at this moment. I could tell you who the last president was, but I cannot tell you who the current president of Korea is. You know what I mean? But we know what he's doing. I know what he's doing. So why is I wouldn't know any of that.
That's right. Your point is that they are a big deal. They affect people's lives. They affect the Korean economy. They affect a lot of people's bottom line. They're a big deal. It's it it seems silly perhaps to somebody who doesn't know anything about it and who says, "Well, they're just a pop band. What difference does it make?" But the point is, it's a huge industry. You know, there are no doubt many industries that people do think are a big deal that don't actually involve as much money as
Well,
literally their one group involves.
they're bringing in a percentage of the country's GDP, and that is the
Yeah,
absolute truth. It's not
that's right.
me making crap up. And
No, no.
and the fact that all of a sudden everybody's watching K-dramas and Korean movies and eating Korean food, and why do you think they're doing that? Do you think that just happened like organically?
No, it doesn't. Although I will say that I have been watching Korean movies, and that's not literally because of them. I was already interested.
Oh,
This just sort of makes me more interested,
able
maybe. But
for yeah.
yeah, I mean, Bong Joon-ho's been making great movies since before I ever heard of BTS. Now, I should point out that once again, just as in our first episode, I have Hank the dog here, and I went out and purchased a special microphone so that people can hear all of the noise that he makes. And I hope it turns out that was worth it. He's now, just in case people are wondering, last time he was chewing on a plastic bone, but this time he's chewing on a slipper, or at least it was a slipper at one point. Right now, I'm not sure. It doesn't look much like a slipper anymore. He's pretty much been destroying it for the last year. I'll also point out one thing before we get into music, that when you told me that they had announced that they were not making a decision uh, about the military service, it seems to me that that was the governmental equivalent of when I called you earlier to tell you that I was going to be calling you in a minute.
Yeah, I think you might be right about that.
Yeah. I also want to point out that Hank is now has now located an entire box of Kleenex. And normally, if I wasn't recording a podcast, I would stop him from destroying it. But I can't do two things at once. So he's. I'm picturing how much of a mess that he's going to make without. But at least it keeps him occupied.
There
Keeps
you
him off the street. Keeps him off the streets.
go.
Okay. All right. I think it is time to start talking about music. So we have palavered for almost 13 minutes about stuff that isn't really about music. So let's just set up what we're going to be talking about. Musically, we're going to be talking about the song Lie, which is a Jimin song. That's correct.
Yes. It's
And we,
off of the album Wings from 2016. And the one thing I have to say about Wings, this is a very strange thing, and I'll have to ask your opinion on this. You know how when you think about the Beatles, you think about Rubber Soul in a certain way, as sort of a transition album?
sure. Yeah.
That's the way I look at Wings.
Oh, okay. Maybe we
It's,
should get into that in case somebody doesn't know that Beatles record. What you mean is Rubber Soul was sort of a record that sort of announced, oh, now the Beatles are moving into kind of the adult version of their career. Like, is that fair to? Is that the kind of comparison you mean? Like before that, the Beatles had been they were great and they were very very popular. But Rubber Soul, I think Rubber Soul, the analogy is not perfect, but I believe Rubber Soul was the record they made after they stopped touring and they announced they were going to focus on making records a lot more. I think that's right. And Rubber Soul was kind of a great leap forward in terms of artistic achievement.
and that's really, that's how I feel about this album. It's almost like not that, and it wasn't actually the transition that everyone acknowledges. The transition everyone acknowledges is about a year before. But I feel like when this album came out, that it almost said, "Hey, we're BTS. This is us right here." Like it
Okay.
was very much a transition into they're becoming a little less. They were growing up a little more and growing
Okay.
up musically as well.
Does that have anything to do with the subject matter of the songs? Was there an adjustment there?
The subject matter changed, like I said, around the year before. They started to get a little bit more lighter, not necessarily in their subject matter, but they were a little bit lighter musically. And this one just always, every time I listen to it, it's just like, oh, this is when they really found their footing.
Okay.
And they were like, this is what we're looking for.
Okay, that sounds good. Let me set up the next, or rather the first music excerpt we're going to listen to. Okay, we need to talk for just a minute about the music samples that they used on this track because it's a slightly confusing situation.
Yes.
And I should point out when I say it's slightly confusing, it'd be more accurate to say it's not confusing for some people, but very confusing for others. And in this case, I'm the person who was very confused. And Gina told me off the air that she wanted me to be very clear to the audience in my remarks that I was confused and she was not. Okay? So let me explain what happened. The situation is that my research was incomplete. I think that's a good way to put it. There was an error on YouTube, and instead of researching further to determine that I was reading something wrong, I just assumed it was right, and I jumped to conclusions, which Gina did not do, but she did more research than I did. It turns out that there are two different music excerpts that they're using from two different recordings. At least it appears to be from two different recordings, but they're what's that? Okay, all right, I'm explaining it. Don't worry, I'm making it very clear that I'm at fault. You're not at fault at all.
I don't care. It doesn't even matter that you're at fault. I just wanted to be clear.
No, it matters a lot actually. But okay, so here's the point. The larger piece of music that they took these two excerpts from was an opera by
De Falla.
is it Manuel de Falla? Is that right?
Uh-huh.
I think that's right. Yeah, Manuel de Falla from 1913 is when this opera was originally produced, and of course the recordings they're using are from much more recently than that. But the string sample that we're going to hear first appears to be a sample from a vinyl recording of the opera, and the guitar sample that we're going to get into after that is from the same opera, but it appears to be an arrangement of an excerpt from the opera, an arrangement for guitar that was performed as a standalone piece by the artist in question. Now, that might seem a little pedantic and not that interesting to some people, but once I figure out I've been wrong about something, I retreat into pedantry to make myself look good in retrospect. I have to explain that it was a little slightly confusing because it was two different recordings. One was orchestral and one is guitar, but they both, as far as we can tell, are both from that same opera. And the guitar piece is called, I hope I'm pronouncing this right. You let me know if I get this wrong, Gina. Danza Española.
Number one.
Number one. Very good. Thank you because there might be more Danza Españolas at some other point, which we don't know about, but we're not concerned with those because BTS did not sample them. So we'll let someone else talk about those. Okay. So right now we're about to listen to the sample. It appears to be from a vinyl record. You can hear that scratchy vinyl sound at the beginning if you listen very closely. We're going to listen to that string sample now. Okay, so what you get in the beginning of this track is that strings intro, and then you get the classical guitar sample, and the whole song is built around that classical guitar sample. You get a lot of that sample throughout. It comes back around many times in the song. let's see. Why don't we play the guitar sample so people can hear that? And I'm going to bring that in just a moment. Okay, so that was the brief classical guitar sample that you essentially it sounds to me like they built the song around that sample. That's my guess, that they made a loop out of that and wrote the song around it. Now, who were the other writers besides Jen on this song?
No,
I'm sorry, Jim. My fault.
it was Jimin, and I believe Doc Skim was in on it. I'm double checking it right now because I'm not having a good brain day.
Okay, well, nobody needs to know about that. You told me earlier you thought P.D. Bang was one of the co-writers on it, but you're not sure about that.
Doc Skim, P.D. Bang, Jimin, P-Dog, and Sumin.
Okay, so a lot of people.
There were, quite a few.
Okay. And so let's see. Let's talk about we're going to get to the verse in a minute here. Anything else we need to say about the two samples at the top? Do you have any comments about that?
I don't think so. I find it, and it's almost a calm, like the strings are almost, it's not calming. It's the opposite. It makes you very anxious.
Okay, that's interesting. Yeah, there's a sort of tension. There's a tension in that guitar part that they made a loop out of, and I think that's true. I think the strings at the top have a kind of a haunting quality. Maybe we should talk about this before we get into the verse. Before we play that, let's talk a little bit about some stuff we've talked about before, which is that you feel that it's very inventive the way they match the instrumental music to what's going on in the lyrics.
Yeah, it's very, I mean, obviously the song's called Lie. It's about getting caught in a lie, but it's not in a relationship with two people. It's very much about the lies that you tell yourself, the public face that you show people, and the lies that you have to continually act out to live behind that mask that you wear in public. And the song makes you feel like you're trapped. There's a lot of tension. It's very disconcerting. It's it's got this eerie sort of, again, anxious quality to it that you feel when you tell a lie, because you have to keep telling it. It's a vicious cycle.
Yeah, I think that's right. And there's a kind of a dark, even though this is ostensibly a catchy pop song, it's a very dark quality, especially to the verses, because they have that guitar sample.
And it's just a really ominous kind of circular, you're kind of stuck going down a drain almost when you listen to the song.
Yeah, that's a good analogy for it. Now, let's see. I guess it's reasonable to assume that when he's talking about the masks you wear and how you present yourself to the public, I guess it's reasonable to guess that had a lot to do with being a public figure. I mean, their career they'd been fairly successful at the point when this record came out. Is that fair to say? At least in Korea.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So he's a public figure at that point. So he may have been talking about that specifically, but of course, people can relate. I mean, we all go through that. Even if you're not famous, you still have to present yourself to the other humans.
Exactly. And plus, he's one of those people that is notoriously hard on himself.
Okay.
He never thinks he for a long time, I'm not sure how he is now with this, but for a long time, never thought he was good enough, thought he could sing better, thought he could do everything better, would sleep
You mean he thought he should?
Yeah, he really thought, nobody
He
was
felt
saying,
that he felt he needed to do better.
he always felt that he had to do better.
Right.
And he would work extra hard. Like, I mean, there's very many live streams of him talking about how he would sleep in the studio and then wake up and start practicing and then eat something and take a nap and wake up and start practicing, even when no one else was there.
Yeah, he put a lot of pressure on himself.
He put a lot of pressure on himself. And some of it is cultural due to the area of Korea that he's from, but a lot of it, I think, he internalized.
Okay. Do you have any knowledge about, do you have some sense that there was pressure on him from anyone else, or was it more just himself?
I think a lot of it was from himself. There was some pressure before they actually released anything, because he joined the company 6 months before they put out their first album.
Was he the last one to join the group?
Last one to join the group.
Okay.
He was always, and he comes from a part of Korea that's kind of known for the best way to describe it, it's known for its manly men. And he is
just like my neighborhood is.
Exactly, just like your hood.
My hood.
He's terribly, terribly pretty. He's a very pretty human.
Agreed.
Graceful. He's a dancer. He's, though he did have he has a lot of martial arts training, like he could kick your ass, but he didn't kind of fit in with the mentality of the area where he was from. He's from Busan.
Okay.
Busan is apparently known for its manly men.
All right. Well, I imagine that's probably news to a lot of Americans, not knowing too much about Busan specifically. But let me ask you another question. What was his music background before he joined the group?
His music background was, and this is typical of Korea, he was the top student in contemporary dance at Busan High School for the Arts.
Okay, so essentially he had no musical background before he joined BTS. Is that fair to say?
He obviously, he had a little bit, because at this point he plays piano and that kind of stuff.
Okay, but what I'm getting at is that obviously dance is related to music, very much so. But the point I'm getting at is that this may have contributed to a self-consciousness that if he joined a group where everybody else was sort of ahead of him in terms of musical ability, that might have been one of that you could see why that might have made him feel self-conscious.
Well, and one of the things too was that, they were very hip hop based when they started, and he was a contemporary dancer. So
okay.
learning any part of that different set of rhythm probably didn't go that well.
Yeah, so he probably felt like he was sort of a little bit behind everybody else in the group.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay. So was this his first big song where he was featured, or where he was one of the co-writers?
I don't believe so. I believe that he had a few other songs before this. Not a lot. Okay. He's still to this day probably, I don't know what he has now, but he only had like 9, 11, 10 copyrights to his name right now.
Okay. So what I'm wondering is this song, would you describe this song as a breakthrough for him personally in some way? Like is this a creative breakthrough, do you think, or?
Absolutely, I think so.
You think so? Okay.
Yeah,
it's a successful song.
It wasn't like a huge hit song, but put it this way, dude has this particular member of the group has the highest streamed SoundCloud song in history.
Okay. Did that come out after this song?
I believe it did come out after the song, it's just something that he put on SoundCloud, which they all tend to do, just like write a song and throw it on there. But this one really just, it's just a super interesting song. Like, it's one of those, he's had a few songs that are really popular, especially popular among ARMY, but this one just really strikes me as something that's on a different level.
Okay. I think this song is very inventive. Let me talk about some of that before we get to the music of the verse. I want to set it up a little bit. There's a lot to listen for in this verse. You've got the guitar sample from the classical piece, and then the drum loop. That's sort of the main music going on in the background. But there's also an additional, what sounds like an electric guitar sample. It might not have been a sample, but some kind of little electric guitar loop in there. There are a bunch of backup vocals, and I've written down sort of unhelpfully some other sounds in there. That means I don't know what else is going on, but there's a lot going on. And you also pointed out when we talked earlier that one of the things that goes on in this track generally is things will come and go. They'll drop out. Like, you'll have something will be happening, and then a sample will appear and then drop out, or the bass might drop out, or guitar part might drop out. There's a lot of, and of course, there's a long tradition of that in hip hop, but there's a lot of that going on in this production.
Yes.
And let me see. Oh, I'm remembering here. Okay, in the verse, there's other stuff too. I'm looking at there's a point where there's kind of a thing that's sort of a transitional that lasts about 7 seconds, and I wrote down that you've got the guitar sample from the classical piece, and you've got some kind of synthesizer part, and then there's an electric guitar chord also, and then there is whether it's a sample or not, I don't know, but some kind of organ sound that's playing a kind of a staccato figure, kind of a dut 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 kind of rhythm.
That's probably Doc's
And
him.
okay, and all of that stuff happens in about 7 seconds of music. That all those things kind of are introduced one at a time. So this is maybe a good point to observe that the production on this record and all the BTS records that I've heard, all the productions I've heard, are very, very complex and nuanced and subtle. There are lots of moving parts, lots of things going on. Sounds to me very much influenced by hip hop generally, because that was a real consistent aspect of 90s hip hop, that the productions were very complicated, lots of different things coming in and out. That's something that hip hop, I think, not that they invented that concept. Of course, there are Beatles records and Beach Boys records where a whole bunch of things are going on. Hendrix records where a whole bunch of things are going on. But hip hop really, it seems to me, came up with this kind of collage kind of production where lots and lots of things are coming in and out. I should point out when I argue that hip hop came up with it, that it really also goes back to dub music in Jamaica, where they would take reggae recordings and drop the bass out, or drop the drums out, or drop the vocals out, or some combination of those things, and do sort of remixes of recordings that originally were singles. And the Jamaican producers really introduced that idea. It was a pretty avant-garde idea at the time. Even the Beatles hadn't really done anything quite like that, as far as I know. And the Jamaicans really came up with that. And hip hop was greatly influenced by that. Okay, so and the point is that the combinations of different instruments, the textures that you hear, are shifting every couple seconds, pretty much throughout this track. It seems to me there's just a whole bunch of shifting, and I think it's fair to say that whoever was producing this track was basically dealing with a whole bunch of moving parts. It's just extraordinarily complicated. Even for me, just to write down what I was hearing, I didn't have to do any work except for listening. But I spent a long time. I've got a very dense piece of paper where I took all these notes. It's hard to, with very tiny writing. There's a lot going on in this track. So I just want to point out, for people that think that K-pop music isn't that creative, isn't that there's not much happening. I can say that is not true. This is very complex production.
Yes.
Okay, all right. And we are now going. So now we're going to listen to. We are up to the verse now, so we're going to listen to the verse part in just a moment.
내게 말해 너의 달콤한 미소는 내게 말해 속삭이듯 내 귓가에 말해 Don't be like a prey Smooth like a snake 벗어나고 싶은데 내게서 떠나줘 내게서 떠나줘 뭐라도 잘 구해줘
Okay, we've been listening to the verse there, and we talked a lot about it before. I just want to point out that, as I said, that.
Can I just say something real quick?
Yeah, you don't have to ask. Just go ahead.
Can we just talk about the tone of his voice for a minute?
Sure. What do you want to say? Go ahead. You go.
He has the most unique voice I've heard in a long time.
Okay, how so?
Because it's high, it's clear. It's really clear. His pronunciation is so, like, the diction. I can understand, I may not understand what the words mean, but I understand the words he's saying.
Okay.
He just has a unique
enunciation.
His enunciation, and he just has a really unique quality to his voice.
Okay. I don't disagree with that, and it seems to me that is a real asset with this song.
Yes.
Because it's complicated. The emotional state that he's talking about in this song is very complicated. Let's talk about songwriting for a moment here. This seems like a perfect time for that. You have told me that a lot of the time you're talking to friends who are what you might describe as K-pop skeptical. Is that fair to say?
Yes.
In other words, both of us, you especially, are known. We should point out, if anybody doesn't know, we're not young. We've been around for a long time. We are on the north side of 50, and you've been friends with a lot of punk rock musicians over the years.
Mm-hmm.
I've been friends with a handful of them, and I've played rock and roll for a long time. And what it comes down to is you have lots of friends who aren't even, it seems to me, are probably not even completely sold on, say, classic rock, much less K-pop. Is that fair to say? Like, you probably have friends that think the Beatles suck, I would guess.
Well, I have had the discussion even in the past week of the fact that K-pop is not a genre. K-pop is an industry.
Yeah.
It's kind of like calling every bit of music that comes out of the U.S. as like America rock. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, even popular music, it seems to me, is not a genre, and people get confused about that. I want to talk about that for just a moment in the context of American music specifically. A lot of people think pop music means whatever music they don't like. And
yep.
Pop music is really just a marketing phenomenon. It really doesn't have much to do with any particular style of music. But the Beatles are pop music. So is Frank Sinatra. And so are BTS and any number of other people. I mean, popular music just basically means that it's marketed towards a popular audience.
Or towards the music charts. And if you remember correctly, the late 70s in Great Britain, who was on the charts?
Yeah, well, lots of weird stuff. Like the Pistols were on the charts for a while. And
the freaking Sex Pistols, man.
Yeah, exactly. Because what that meant was lots of people were buying the record. It doesn't have to be slickly produced and packaged for it to sell a lot of records. Obviously that helps, but there's not an automatic connection. I mean, in general, I think when people use the word pop as a way of just sort of like airing their prejudices and their snobbery, I don't have a lot of patience for it. I find that irritating. But I also let's get into some of the things that you hear when you talk to friends about, because the point is that I don't have this problem because I like BTS, but I don't really talk about them much when I'm going about my daily life. But
Well,
but
I have
but
people ask.
but you do because you're a super fan.
Well, no, I do because people ask me about them, especially after the first podcast.
Oh, okay.
Because people, I
Friends
people,
have been asking you since.
hmm
See, I didn't tell any of my friends about the podcast, so nobody asked me about it.
because well, what the one question I got asked that I was like, "What are you talking about?" was why BTS?
Why would you do a podcast about it?
Why would I do a podcast? I'm like, because the story, the music, the people involved, it's a really interesting story
Yeah, no,
because
I
it's
agree with that.
our stories. It's not like stories you hear about bands in the West. You know what I mean? They got
No,
together,
it's
Raj,
very unusual.
back, game over.
Yeah, no,
Yeah.
I do want to point out, this is maybe a good place to point out, just in case anybody's wondering about this. I'm not going to pretend that I'm not partly interested in doing this podcast because I'm hoping that people will listen to it, and I'm hoping that eventually the algorithms will somehow figure out a way to make money for me. I'm not going to pretend that's not true. But at the same time, I don't feel bad about that because they really are a fascinating topic. I mean, we've already recorded, we haven't aired them all yet, but we've recorded many hours where I've heard you talking about the history of the band and the phenomenon of their fan base, and all these topics to me are very interesting. You know, I'm a musician, and I have a music degree, music education, so I'm particularly interested in the music side of it. But they're also just an interesting subject generally. Now
Yeah.
we shouldn't get too far down that road though, because we're supposed to be talking about music today. We've already talked about this other stuff elsewhere. But I want to point out that one of the things you've told me when people are skeptical about
Oh,
BTS. They basically they're hearing you say you're singing their praises. You're talking about you like BTS. They're great. You like their music. And what is it people always say to you? Do they what?
do they write their own music?
Do they write their own music? Okay. And
What?
this go ahead.
Ever heard that? Like, did you listen to Pearl Jam? You know, back in the day, hear your first Pearl Jam song and go, I wonder if they wrote that. They must not have written that. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah.
It's
Yeah,
so weird.
your point is it's a double standard. There's a lot going on here. There's a double standard that people would ask, did they write that? The implication being that if they didn't write it, that there's some kind of a scam going on. If they didn't write their own music,
Or that it's less than because they didn't write it.
or right, or that it couldn't be as good because they didn't write. And the thing is, I just want to point out that a lot of people that grew up with rock and roll, or that always lived in a world when rock and roll was around, might not be aware that historically, before rock and roll existed, the idea of singers also writing their own songs was almost unheard of. I mean, it wasn't completely unheard of, but it was very rare. It was not the norm. When you
No.
had people like Judy Garland and Bing Crosby and Frank Sinatra, they weren't songwriters. I mean, occasionally somebody like that would be a writer, and you had unusual people like Fats Waller who did everything. You know, he wrote and played piano and sang, but that was not typical. It was definitely unusual for somebody to be like that. It was more
Any song?
something. Hmm?
Did Elvis write any songs?
As far as I know, he did not. I'm not aware of it. I mean, now. I will say, early rock and roll artists often did write their own songs, but it varied. It depended on the artist. They didn't all write. And before rock and roll, you sometimes had writers in other styles of music that maybe wouldn't be called pop music, like sometimes in what we now call roots music, like so-called hillbilly and race music and blues and all that. You know, people often did write stuff, but generally speaking, singers were expected to sing. They were not expected to be great songwriters. Again, there were exceptions, but It was not the norm. There were plenty of songwriters that never wrote a song their whole lives, and nobody ever questioned that. And songwriters weren't expected to sing, and people who played piano were not expected to write or sing or whatever. I mean, it was not. It was these jobs were sort of things were done by committee. Popular music essentially was done by specialists working together. That was the norm. That was the norm for a long, long time, long before rock and roll ever existed. That was what
Right.
people typically found when they listened to music, and even in fact, a lot of roots musicians, it turns out they might be pretending that they'd written the song, but they hadn't. You know, that's what happened with the Carter
Yeah.
family.
Uh-huh.
A.P. Carter would claim to have written stuff, and it turned out he was just
Josh,
uh, he,
Josh.
I'm trying to avoid obscenities here, but he was basically committing fraud by claiming that he'd written all these songs that that have forever been associated with them. They were their music was wonderful, but he claimed to have written stuff that he just heard somebody singing somewhere, and then he just wrote it down and collected the royalties for it. Okay, so that's one thing. The point is, before rock and roll, people were not expected to write their own songs. That was not the norm. It's also true that even in a lot of early rock and roll history, a lot of people didn't write their stuff. I mean, you had people that were great writers and artists like Chuck Berry, but Jerry Lee Lewis only wrote a handful of things. Really didn't write very much, and Carl Perkins was a good writer, but Elvis didn't write. Bo Diddley was more creative. He did write a lot of stuff, but he didn't write everything. You know, he had stuff written for him by Willie Dixon. In other words, it was kind of some people wrote and some people didn't in early rock and roll. The Beatles were the artists that really changed the whole attitude about they created the expectation that a rock and roll band was supposed to be self-contained like that. Again, they didn't invent it. You know, they weren't the first to do it. Buddy Holly was a big influence on them because he was a songwriter and singer and guitar player, and he did everything just as Chuck Berry had done before him. But the Beatles were the ones that really established the
That
standard.
yes.
Yeah, and I would argue, I'm a big Beatles fan, but I would argue that it's not good that they did that. And here's where I'm going to get into something that a lot of people are either going to not agree with or are just going to be confused by, but let's get into it. I don't think the Beatles did us any favors by saying that bands should be able to do everything in-house, because what I think has happened as a result of that is a lot of mediocre songwriting has been foisted on us by people that maybe were good singers or good guitar players or good bass players or whatever, but that don't really have much of a gift for songwriting and don't know much about the craft. And we've had to listen to a lot of subpar songwriting, I think, over the years as a result. Obviously, there are many great exceptions to that. There are a lot of rock and roll bands and
Well, and
R&B artists who are great songwriters. Some country artists are great.
that's the argument for the systems that they have, like at Hive right now, or that they have for years. Because let's say you roll into P.D. Bang's office with a mediocre song. You've got a sounding board where somebody's going to say, yeah, this isn't so great. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
You're not going to get that kind of song, because there's always somebody around to give you feedback.
Sure.
So,
It's like the situation. I mean, this is another thing that's worth pointing out, that the K-pop situation is very similar to the situation that you had in American popular music at a place like Motown, where you had a lot of specialists, but you also had, it varied. You had some people were like Smokey Robinson. He was obviously one of the great singers, but also a great songwriter, great producer. He would do a bunch of different things. Different people had different talents, and there were some people that just wrote there. And if you were a singer, like somebody like Marvin Gaye, often did other people's stuff, but if Marvin Gaye wrote a bunch of great stuff and brought it in, he could get it recorded, because if it passed muster, it was really good. And the point is that the quality control was the issue. It wasn't the issue was not we have a prejudice that singers are expected to write. Nobody cared about that at Motown. The deal was is the song any good? You know, that was
That's
the
exactly
issue.
it. That's the difference. It's not who does it. It's the finished product that counts.
Yeah, quality is this quality control at a place like Motown, and this was the case in the popular music industry before rock and roll. Quality control was all about does this song cut the mustard? Is this song good enough? And that's a pretty good system. When you have specialization, it means, at least in theory, that mediocre songs don't get recorded. That's the way it's supposed to work. Obviously, it doesn't always work that way, but that's in theory what's supposed to happen. So you got a situation here where where the members of BTS, isn't it true that they typically either write or co-write their material most of the time?
I would honestly put it at about 99%.
Okay. And just to be clear, just to be clear, by the members of the group, the seven singing members of the group. Okay, but to be clear though, this song, I forget how many writers, it was like 5 or 6 writers maybe on this tune, and they're not all in the group. Some of the people were outside writers co-writing with Jimin, and that's probably true generally. Is it also true that most of the material is co-write material where
they also, I think the difference between how they do it and how we would do it here is that people here would have a big problem with person A throwing in their ideas for what's going to happen with the drums in the second verse and taking credit for that. Whereas over there, they have no problem whatsoever going, that person helped put them on this song.
When you say put them on the song, you mean put them on the credits for having written it?
Yep.
Yeah, okay. Because in my world, and I guess maybe I shouldn't be saying this, but I would not put a drummer typically as a co-writer if he came up with a drum.
I'm not playing the drums. I'm talking about the person that walks in and goes, you know what would sound really good right there? If you do this and do it for the rest of the song. Like, just somebody dropping their opinion on it and you taking their advice.
Yeah. Well, what I'm saying is, I would not usually give somebody a co-writing credit for that myself, but and you're not legally obligated to. So
no,
I don't. But the point is, you can make the case that it's not only to their credit that they do it, but it's also arguably a smart business move, because if people know that they can get a co-credit by making a good arranging suggestion, then there's an incentive for everybody who's basically involved with the project to be as creative as possible. I mean, that's really the point. Like, whereas my situation is different. I'm always desperate to make a dollar, so I'm not eager to be handing out co-credits all the time. But that's a different story. But they have a very different business model. And it should be pointed out that those guys make a lot more money every year than I do.
Well, and yeah, definitely. But I mean, what you'll notice a lot of times is the person that gets credited as the producer also gets credited on the song.
Yeah.
A lot. Like, I would venture a guess and say that is also a 99% occurrence.
Yeah, okay. That's interesting.
Because if you're in the studio producing the song, you have a say over what's happening.
Yeah.
And that final song, you had your hand in.
Yeah. Well, my guess would be, this is not the case when I work, but it is the case when some artists work. I mean, I've talked to producers that tell me that lots of artists come in and the songs are not completely finished. I at least a kind of an anecdotal selection of data from the handful of times I've talked to record producers about this. They've told me that it's not that uncommon for artists to come in and then they do some punching up in the studio. What I mean is the producer will actually make suggestions and they will rearrange the song. That doesn't tend to happen with me, but that's mainly because I don't want to pay anyone else to do it. But it's not uncommon, and my guess would be that now you can tell me if you know if this is true, but my guess would be that the whole process from the original idea for a song to actually getting it mastered, I would imagine that generally the in-house producers that they have, which are, you tell me, but I mean they have a few producers that are just sort of that are producing them a lot of the time, and then some of the guys in the group are also co-producers. Is that correct?
Yeah. Like
So
Suga
it's made.
does a lot of the production.
Sugar does a lot of production. Okay.
Yeah.
So my guess would be that when a song's being written, there's probably some idea of who the producer is going to be when they do the record. I'm just speculating, but I would guess that there is. I mean, put it this way: if you're in a rock and roll band and it costs money to record, and you don't go in the studio all that often, and you play live a lot, then it's a very different. That's more like the old model that my old band used to follow, and my current band mostly follows that model. But those guys are essentially record makers, and not that they don't play live; they do tons of touring. But they essentially what they're doing is they're making recordings. So it seems to me that there's not a huge distinction between writing a song and recording a song. It's all pretty much the same process, and I would guess that people that produce for them are also involved with the writing, and there's probably not a huge distinction. It's not like a singer-songwriter thing where, Bob Dylan writes songs all the time by himself and then comes into the studio and there's this sort of adversarial relationship where he doesn't care about record production and it's just kind of, he does it out of necessity. Like with them,
But I
it
think
seems to.
what happened is because they started off so small, if an employee was there, and it crosses over to everything. If somebody was there and they knew how to do it, they would do it. They all work together constantly. I mean, especially things like their early videos. Most of the actors in their early videos are their freaking managers because they couldn't afford actors, so the managers acted. You know what I mean? Like,
right. Well, it was sort of an expense saving idea at first. And
I think they discovered, you know what, this really works for us.
Yeah, it works for them, right?
Because they all work together on time, and like what I told you the other day, the producer on this particular song is also the keyboard player in their backup band.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like, or synth player. I mean, everybody has. You're never going to be out of work. You know what I mean? There's always something for you to do.
Yeah. Well, the situation here, I think it's fair to say, is kind of a hybrid of everything's done in house and specialization. Like there are people that maybe have a primary job where that's really their strength, but they also do other things. It's not uncommon. Most of the people in the organization kind of have a hyphen job description, it seems to me. Like they might be primarily a producer, but they also co-write. Maybe somebody's primarily a keyboard player, but also does a little bit of production, or maybe somebody's primarily a singer, but also co-writes. Basically,
for many years, the CEO was their producer and also a songwriter.
There you go. Exactly. Okay, so let's see. I'm realizing now that I'm looking at this. We've gone even longer than the other episode, and we did not get into some of the list of topics yet, and we haven't even made it through the song. So, whoever was guessing that we were going to go longer than an hour,
you win.
They win. Okay, so let's see. Do we want to save some of these topics for later episodes, or should we jump into them? The idea that
Yeah, I think we should finish the song.
okay, we should finish the song. Let's see. What are we up to now? We need to get to the pre-chorus, so let me set that up, and then we will play that. The pre-chorus is essentially, as you might imagine, is just the section that sets up the chorus being the main event. So there's not a lot to say about that. I just want to point out I have many more notes about all the different kinds of musical parts that are in these songs, but in the interest of getting this thing in under 2 hours, I'm not going to get into all the detail on that, even though I have
But
voluminous notes here about it. Hmm?
isn't it where that thing happens that I don't know how to describe because I don't.
Right.
You're,
That's the core. That's the chorus. So we're going to get to that in just a moment. Okay. So let me set this up. We are about to listen to the pre-chorus, and let's go to that now.
나도 잘 구해줘 않게 속돼 도망쳐봐도 거짓 속에 빠져있어 간이 날
Okay, so that was the pre-chorus, and now we're getting into the real. For me, I think this is one of the most interesting, arguably the most interesting part of the song from a music theory perspective. This is the chorus we're talking about, and you've got a lot to say about this. Let me give you a chance here to talk about what you think the chorus is about and what the lyrics are about, the theme and everything.
well, it's very much when you get to the chorus, you will obviously hear him sing "Caught in a Lie," and something happens musically that I don't have the words to describe, but Karl does. But
I've got plenty of words for it.
it changes. What it ends up doing is because it's so free and soaring, it's that strange thing of when you do get caught in a lie, guess what? You're free now. You don't have to lie anymore. So the whole mood changes. It changes vocally. It's less dark. It's brighter. It just changes the entire mood of the song. And then when the song kicks back in, you get caught up in it again. It's almost like self-doubt.
Yeah, I think so. So what's going on? You're basically talking about stuff that a music fan can hear, and I think all this stuff is clear to a listener. I'm going to get into the pretentious side of it, where I talk about the academic part, like how do they achieve all this? How do they get the music to do these things? There's a thing called parallel major and minor, okay, and to kind of oversimplify a little bit, minor chords essentially have a dark kind of sound, and major chords have more of a light sound. So it's kind of day and night. Major chords representing day and sunshine, and the dark of night. That's what minor chords do. And a lot of Western music is built around the contrast between those two different sounds. And so there are songs like "We Can Work It Out" by the Beatles, where Paul McCartney has the beginning part is in major and has a kind of happy, sunshiny kind of a sound, like a lot of his work does. And then for the bridge, John Lennon takes it into the relative minor, which is more of a sad, downbeat kind of a sound, and that's what makes that song interesting. Is that you've got these two things contrasting, and again, that's the contrast between major and minor. Should say relative major and minor for the theory people. Is very common in Western music. It's really what to a large degree what Western music is built on. Western classical music is all built on the interaction and contrast between those two things. Okay, so that's nothing new, whether it's in pop music or classical music or whatever. But what is unusual about this song, it's not new in the sense it hadn't been done before, but it's not that common to this day for this to happen. It's not super common even in classical music. It's definitely not common in pop music.
Yeah.
It's called parallel major and minor. Okay, when you have relative major and minor, and I don't want to get into the math of that, but the basic idea is that they share a key signature, and what that means in terms of what you hear as a listener is there's a smooth transition between major and minor, just as there is in real life when the sun goes down or the sun comes up. It's kind of a natural transition. It doesn't have a wrenching kind of a quality. Like it's not like bright sunshine and all of a sudden, boom, you flip a switch and it's dark. Okay. And the same thing happens in music. There's a kind of I guess you could even, it's almost like a mirror image, the relationship between relative major and minor is such that the transition seems natural and smooth between them. But with parallel major and minor, it's almost like flipping on a switch or flipping off a switch. Okay. So in this song, the main part of the song, the verse and the bridge and essentially everything besides the chorus is in minor. And I think it's, am I right? F sharp minor or G flat minor? I think that's right. Check my notes here. Yeah, it's in G flat minor or F sharp minor. And then it goes to G flat or F sharp major. Okay. And then again, that has a very wrenching kind of quality. And I think that must be because that was the effect they wanted. Because like you said, when you're caught in a lie, it is like flipping on a light. It's sort of like, okay, now I'm not in jail anymore. I don't have to keep doing this. I don't have to, there's no, even though in a way it's bad when people catch you lying, the good thing about it is that now you don't have to keep being that liar anymore. There's a lot of, the pressure's off because you've been found out. And it's
Right.
kind of it definitely, I think the musical idea of going from parallel minor to parallel major is absolutely perfect for that, and it illustrates it very well. It's very effective. Then as far as arranging goes, that's what's going on in terms of composition. But what's going on in terms of arranging is this kind of soaring quality. They really play up the sound of all the vocal harmonies, and it's got just a very big sound at that point, and that fits perfectly the mood that he's getting at with that song.
Yes.
Okay, so am I missing anything? There's one thing I wanted to point out. Again, I'm trying to avoid getting into too much of the music theory here, but I will say that in addition to the parallel major idea, there's also a chord change that happens, a couple of chord changes that happen in the chorus in addition to that are interesting, and then I made notes about them. There are things that what happens is when you go from parallel major to parallel minor, it forces you to do inventive things to go back and forth between the two, because you need to get back into the verse where it's minor again. And there are just some very interesting things that happen in the chords where I didn't recognize them at first. Most of the time when I listen to pop music, I hear chord changes and think, okay, I've heard that change before, or I've written songs with that change before. There are certain standard chord changes that get used over and over again and have been used since before rock and roll existed. And these days, to my ears, most American pop music it's not a very strong creative period as far as chord changes go. This era, chord changes were more inventive in the 60s and 70s in pop music. There are lots of interesting things happening in chords on rock and roll records in the 60s, especially. Tons of inventive stuff happening in R&B. Just specifically talking about chord changes here. There's lots of stuff going on Motown records and on all kinds of songwriting happening in the 70s on various different kinds of R&B. It was a real golden period in various different genres, rock and R&B and related things. As far as people being inventive with chords, a lot of that was going on in the 60s and 70s. Less true after that. Very much not the case now, where to my ears, the use of chords has become really pretty lazy, I think, these days. So I point all that out to give them credit for not doing that. So here's another case where some people might be inclined through prejudice to assume that K-pop music is not very inventive. Anybody who feels that way, it's fine if you don't like it. If you don't enjoy the song, that's fine. But I can definitely assure people that that there's a lot of richness and complexity going on in the chord changes. There's stuff in there that I had to listen to a bunch before I could figure out what was going on. And that does not happen if I listen to current popular music most of the time. It was pretty unusual. I've actually kind of gotten used to not being surprised by chords in pop music from, in the last 20, 30 years generally. You don't hear too many. If you get a music degree, you take a whole bunch of semesters learning about chords. You learn the basic vocabulary that pop music uses for the most part in
Well,
school. And
do you remember the first thing you said to me when I sent you this song?
I do remember now because you've reminded me. But why
But
don't you remind me again? What did I say?
I sent Karl this song, and 3 minutes later, I got a phone call that said, if I had written this song, I'd be really proud of myself.
Yeah, I still feel that way. If anything, I feel more strongly about it now because now that I've actually sat down and analyzed it, I found more stuff that I didn't notice when I first heard it. Because the truth is, when you listen to it, you just enjoy it, and even I do that most of the time. I'm trying to listen like a normal person and not listen like a person analyzing and transcribing music every second because that's work. I enjoy it, but it is work. It's not like when most people listen to music, it's fun. And for me, it's fun, but it's also work. But anyway, yeah, I would have been very proud to have written this song, and anybody who worked on this song should be proud of it because it's very, very inventive, very creative, and that's specifically talking about the song, not about the arrangement, which is also creative, and the production, which is also very inventive. And then, of course, obviously the singing is terrific. So there's a whole bunch of stuff going on here. The bottom line for me is if you don't like this kind of music, that's fine. But anybody who tells me that this stuff is lazy and phoned in, that is absolutely not true. And I would stake my reputation, which this is not much of a risk for me, I suppose. I'm not risking very much when I do that, but I'm happy to stake my name and reputation on the statement that this is a very inventive song. Just the writing specifically, okay? Production and all of that other stuff also very inventive, but the writing very unusual. The people that wrote this should be very proud of it. Okay, is that enough yammering about that? Anything else you want to add to talking about the chorus or the rest of the song? No, we covered it there. You think? Okay.
That was some transition, like yammer, yammer, yammer. Okay, I'm done.
Okay. Well, all good things have to come to an end, Gina. I have to stop yammering at some point. We've. It's sort of like that. It's sort of like that. That thing. Supposedly, somebody said to Mark Twain one day it was raining really hard, and somebody looked up at the rain and said to Twain, "Do you think it'll stop raining?" And said, "Well, it always has." And that's pretty much the situation. Do you think Karl will stop talking? Well, he always has before. Okay. All right. So here's what I'm going to say. We're going to listen to the chorus now, and I think then we're going to pretty much wrap up the episode after that. So let's get to the chorus. Here we go. Okay, we've been listening to the chorus of the great song Lie there. And let's see, I think we're going to make an executive decision here. We're not going to play the entire song. If people have a problem with that and want to tell us, we get feedback that people think we should have the complete song when we do an analysis like this. I am happy to hear them out on that, and we'll make a different decision later if we get a lot of feedback. But the way I look at it is I assume anybody who's, what are we at almost at the hour and maybe hour and 15-minute mark here. It seems to me that anybody who's been listening to me yammering about this song for this long probably has heard the song already. I would guess they already like the song, or they wouldn't be listening to me talk about it for more than an hour. I should say to us talk about it for more than an
Here's
hour.
the thing. If you have any other suggestions for songs that you want us to tear apart and talk about for an hour, please put them in the comments. We'd love to
Yes,
know.
please do. And that is the perfect segue to us reminding people to like and comment and subscribe. Please subscribe to my YouTube channel because it makes it possible for us to do more of these. If you made it all the way to this point, if you've listened for more than an hour and you enjoyed this podcast, then we definitely encourage you to like, comment, and subscribe because then we can do tons more of them. We've recorded a bunch already, and we would like to keep doing them. And if you have ideas for more that you'd like to hear from us, please let us know. You know where to find us. Anything else, Gina, before we sign off?
To put it quite frankly, no.
Okay, very good. All right, so we have been, as usual, Gina Palla and myself, Karl Straub, and this has been another episode of Gina and Karl Put It Quite Frankly, and we will see you next time. Thank you for listening.